I feel like a little bit of a fraud here. I have no right to stand up and have this conversation any more than anybody else in the room. And I'd like to point out that in the program it says it's a patchwork quit. And I hope it's not teams quitting. I think if I have an opinion, my opinion's based upon running a program whereby I have lots of data points. I meet an extremely large number of different teams, and much as I would like to think I was anything like Paul Graham, he can outdo me even more. He meets and speaks to so many different startups, he can start to see patterns in the teams that take part in places like Y Combinator and actually start to see themes that come through. So, the theme of the notional idea of a quilt is it's a functional thing, but it's something that's very personal, and everybody has a quilt, but every quilt is different. And at the end of the day, there's no such thing as two teams which are exactly the same, and hopefully that'll come out here. So, teams. What should you look for in a team? One of the hardest things you can actually do when you're building a team is actually employ somebody who's smarter than you. This is really, really important, especially at a very early stage. Getting smart people in a room is hard, and sometimes you end up having not to employ people. Never compromise at an early stage, because it's the rock bed, it's the foundation on which your whole startup's going to be based. And actually be ballsy enough to admit that there are actually people who are even smarter than you, and those are the people actually you should be trying to convince to start and to help you in these businesses. Oh. You also need people who really, really feel passionate about what you do. There's no good reason. Everything that you do in a startup is against you. Everything that you do is bound for failure. The number of people who actually succeed in startups represents a very, very small part of the ecosystem. But that's not to say they shouldn't try. But there needs to be a bit of your brain which is kind of a little bit wired up the wrong way, that when everything is against you, that you actually just want to drive through. And it's essentially because you're passionate about what you want to do. There's an interesting blog post by a guy called Fred Wilson, who actually talked about startups being very like rock bands. And the very first album, or your very first startup, is completely driven by passion. There's a problem, there's something that you want to address, it just keeps you awake at night. And you normally spend a massive amount of time trying to get to that very first thing. When you move on to your second and third startup, if you're successful, it tends to be driven more by something which you see an issue that you think you can execute better, you can deliver, you can do something from a solution point of view. And in the context of a rock band, it's the second album's hard. The first album normally takes 6, 7, 8 years. It might be something that's been bugging you for a while. But the second album's slightly different because you've only got 12 months or 18 months to deliver. Dedication. I wasn't sure whether this was dedication or execution. I think dedication is, to me, if you're in a startup and you don't feel tired, you're not working hard enough. One of the big things, if you do have that burning passion about what you do, if you have that burning passion that you actually, all you seem to do is spend your life thinking about your startup, the dedication is not just you, but the rest of the team. It's actually the desire, the push, the commitment, that actually all of the time that you're doing something, it's just to do with, you have to be really selfish about this. And that's the bit that's kind of really important. You need to be dedicated to your startup. And that singularly should be the most important thing in your life. Diversity is really, it's similar to the SMART thing. It's not something you feel comfortable doing when you're building a team, but actually you shouldn't employ people that look like you in the sense of character types, skill types, experience types. It's actually about trying to find people who complement you, or actually, as I describe in some occasions, you love and hate in equal measure. I have actually got there is another founder of Springboard, and he doesn't like coming out much, so I call him my stealth co-founder. And we regularly have blazing arguments and fallout about lots of things. And I get so angry on occasions with him. But 3 or 4 minutes later, you kind of go, right, let's move on. But it's because he's different. He thinks differently from me. And actually, when we look at problems and we have to address problems, we have enough diversification within the team to actually know how to actually address those things. I actually think this is really important. And this is more important not just for today, but actually when you move forward. I personally believe that actually the best teams are the teams that evolve. And that will become a little bit more apparent in kind of the next couple of slides. But people have to, especially at an early stage, you have to be able to do everything. You have to not have the shame to actually be able to do the crappy stuff as well as the glorious stuff. And coming back to the notional idea of the quilt, there really isn't a single solution to this. You might have the same ultimate goal, but 2 teams can equally deliver the same product at the end of the day. And how you get there and how you're made up and the constitution of the team is constantly different. This is actually not a real principle. The real principle, and I'll read it out, is something called the Peter Principle. And it's used in corporates. So in every corporate, an employee tends to rise to their level of incompetency. So you keep getting promoted when you're really good, and you keep getting promoted to the point where you're shit at your job, and then you don't get promoted any further. So you actually get promoted to the level that you're really bad at, which is what kind of holds a lot of corporates back. Arguably with startups, the exact same thing is true, which is startups progress and get as far as they can in terms of the competency of their founders. Those are the guys who actually hold the business back. And that's why you need all of the various different elements. But that only represents a slot, a period in time. So I actually believe, which is not unusual, there are different stages within an organization, within a business. And I break them down into a slightly different set of categories. I call it startup. I call it grow up, which is you're beyond surviving and you're now starting to build, get traction, scale. And the last bit is finish ups, which is one of the big arguments that we have in Europe is do we not have enough teams that know how to finish up, to actually execute to the final part. But every stage requires a different mix and blend in the team, and hence the notional idea of adaptability is actually really important, especially for a founder team. And you can see, I mean, much as and I regularly say this, I personally hate Facebook with a vengeance because of its privacy policies. One has to admire someone like Mark Zuckerberg and his ability to be both a CEO of a startup, a grow-up, and a finish-up. The whole skill sets are completely different. But actually, if you think about it, our dear old friend Steve, much as we love and hate him in equal measure as well, has actually gone through a very similar set of structural ideas, but every time he does it, his team changes. So when he started, it was clearly the two Steves. And then he IPO'd and he started growing. That was the grow up bit. He changed his team. The people he needed around him had to be different people. And that's John Scully on the right. And finally, when he came back, he rebuilt a completely new team. And the team he actually brought together was even different again. So when he started, it was technically led. Scully was all about marketing. Actually, by the time he got to the end, it was a core focus around design, which is Johnny, but actually I think one of the single largest success factors in Apple's history is its operational competency, which is Tim Cook, who's sitting there. So, simply put, there isn't one. They're never the same. They're always different. But it's like 3 dimensions. At any point in time, the blend has to be different things, different options. But actually, as you move through your startup, you need to have the adaptability to change personally, but also to have the idea that one has to change the team constructs and the structure around it. And that's it. Thank you.
Let's start with some questions from the room. One here too.
No, it's not working. Test. John, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering whether you could expand a bit on it here.
Yeah, I can
the
see
first rows. I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on actually moving from a startup phase to a growth phase in terms of team, because you can't actually change the people in terms of firing those people and moving next to other people. I mean, hiring other people. So how do you do that transition between the first two phases? And then in the second and the third phase, it's probably easier because you can hire new people and the organization gets bigger. But in the first phase, when you have less than 10 people moving to 30 people, let's say, how do you manage that?
Well, hopefully. It comes down to the idea behind what I was describing, which is if you've got smart people and they're adaptable.
So basically grow with the people, grow with your team?
I mean, it's an overused statement, but it's true. I always use this expression when people come to me and talk about how I select on Springboard by way of example. We always put the example, which is you've got a smart team with a bad idea, or you've got a bad team with a good idea. Who do you pick? I mean, it's obvious. But the notional idea of someone who has a good idea and the team ever executing on it are nil. A good team with a bad idea, they'll always change. They'll look at it and go, this is a fucking stupid idea, we need to change it. And the key constituent ingredients at that really early stage is really people. I mean, Twitter is a really good example of this as well, which is they're not Mark Zuckerberg. There are certain people who are really good at starting businesses. And as they transition, they change. So the founders, I can't remember how many of the founders in Twitter are still left in them, but they kind of come and go regularly through CEOs.
I think it's maximum one of them still being product
and
manager.
he was CEO, and then he was something else, and then he left, and then he came back as chairman.
Yeah.
And actually, that's probably the biggest difference between the US and Europe, is I personally think that in Europe, most people who start businesses want to cling on to them right the way through the cycle. And actually, most smart people realize at some point they're good at certain things and not at others. So being able to allow yourself. So Steve Jobs actually employed Scully to come in above him and to be the CEO.
Yeah, but how many times does that happen in Europe? Because in Europe, you try to cling on to your startup because the whole culture is more towards keeping up with your company. And while in the US, it's about flipping the company, starting a new company, going IPO, etc. You have a continuous growth phase. But in Europe, it's about growing easily, steadily, so you want to keep control of your company, don't you?
It differs. If you have venture money or growth money, clearly they need to be aggressive, and to build businesses faster is slightly different. I think there's also a slight differential, and it's something which is becoming more common in the States, which is allowing the founders of a business to cash out some of their stock on the way through. And it allows them, if you effectively own all of your business and all of your portfolio and risk is within the business, you will actually potentially slow down the growth because you don't want the business to explode. And you can see this where some of the US high growth companies have had the founders cash out some of the money on the way through, because it changes their dynamic. Once you've got 10 million in the bank, or somebody described, once the founder has a Porsche, he can actually think about, actually, I've got enough money to live off for the rest of my life. Now I want to actually build a really big business, and aligning the interests of the venture funders and also the founders.
Great, thanks.
Next one. One here too.
Hi, John. What about collocated teams? How can you create a perfect team with that?
It's called Google Hangout. Seriously, if you haven't used it, you should. It's fucking awesome, and it kicks the fucking shit out of Skype.
But does it work? I mean, do you have the same level of communication if you're staying in two different countries?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I personally, and this is just a very personal view, is once you've met somebody and you've had coffee or a beer with them, the way one actually interacts, and somebody smarter than me that does management studies will figure this out, the way you interact with somebody after that, either on a phone or Skype, is the value you get out of the relationship is substantially higher. I think you can do it. I think actually, no, I know you can do it. You can do it, but you need to have underpinning it a personal relationship in terms of having met the person.
So you have a startup. Anybody could have a startup. When does a startup finish being a startup and start being mature from the team's point of view?
Oh
as
my
in,
God, I have
so
no idea.
I'll give you,
That's a very good one.
I'll give you a second one to help you with that one. Okay, so team startup. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you seed in them? Values or tasks? So you want them to do stuff, or you want them to have certain values? Then they can pass on to other startups coming after them, because that's the point, right? You build them, you help them do something, and then maybe they can set an example for the other ones coming from behind.
Are you asking this in the context of Springboard?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So what I do, and I'm very insistent on this, is teams that participate in my program actually have to come back and they help the next teams. So one of the big things is, for anybody who doesn't know, Springboard effectively works around mentorship, getting other entrepreneurs to come and help, people who've been there before, done it, coming back to help pay forward the younger teams. But in that process, these teams get exceptionally spoiled by the amount of attention, the amount of support they get from the wider community. And I don't even have to ask my teams, because my teams understand the value of being helped and mentorship. But it also helps to drive towards communities. So it helps different layers of different people at different stages to interact where they wouldn't ordinarily interact. And that's, I think, one of the key constituent ingredients of something like an accelerator, whether it's mine or somebody else's, is that creates critical mass in a location where actually you create tangible things for people to work around and with. And actually, I think it's a really valuable tool to help build ecosystems, especially where ecosystems are very, very small and fragile.